Hi everyone, how are you doing? How has your November been, your reading over the past month? I found that I had a bit of a sort of shaky month. I mean, it's partly because I had some books which I really enjoyed, and then some which I didn't enjoy so much and gave up on and didn't finish reading. And I don't know if that's about the books themselves or sort of my mood, because I've found in the past month that I've been feeling a bit down, like not depressed exactly, just a bit glum and lacking in energy. And I think this might be a seasonal thing I have, where just every November I sort of get this way. I don't know if it's sort of the changing light and the changing weather, or that I start getting reflective about the past year and things I did or didn't do, but yeah, it's a thing I've noticed. Have you ever noticed this, that sort of year on year, at a certain time of year, you'll find your mood starts changing in a certain way, and I've definitely found that this past month. But there are some books that I've read and really loved, and it makes me happy talking about those books. So I'm gonna chat about them now and my reactions to them. So first off, there's Yoko Ogawa's novel, The Memory Police, and this is the second novel I've read by Ogawa before, and I found it so fascinating how this author approaches the subject of memory, because I've read her novel The Housekeeper and the Professor, I think that's what it was called before, which is about a relationship between a housekeeper and a professor, who the professor doesn't have a short-term memory. He can't remember what happened to him most recently. I think every just few minutes, like, his memory resets, and so it's about the struggle of having a relationship with somebody who has this condition, and it just makes you think about memory and relationships and intimacy in such a different way, and the Memory Police did that, but from a completely different side. It's a kind of dystopian tale slash fable about an island, and the narrator lives on this island where things start disappearing and are made to disappear through this sort of governmental enforcement, and it's sort of magical, where certain flowers will disappear, and they just sort of disappear overnight, and people's memories of those objects start disappearing as well, but then there are some people in the community who still remember these things, and those people who do remember get in trouble and are arrested and disappeared, and so it has this very like totalitarian feel to it, and but it's not a typical dystopian type novel, because the way she approaches the subject, it's much more like almost philosophical in tone, but not in a sort of pretentious highfalutin way. It is more like a fable in how there'll be certain themes and subjects which come up and recur and have this sort of subtle, almost like unconscious meaning. And towards the end of the book, I found it incredibly moving, and yeah, so I love this book. I'm so glad that I read it, and yeah, the cover is amazing. It's so beautiful, and I'm glad that this has been appearing on some of the best books of the year lists, because yeah, I think it's really extraordinary. And another book I started reading but didn't finish, and which also has a fable-like or fairy tale feel to it, is Gingerbread by Helen Oyeyemi. And I just couldn't get into this novel, and I've heard a similar thing from a lot of people. And an exciting thing about this novel is this past month I've formed a physical book club, the first physical book club I've belonged to in many years. And so we got together to discuss this book, and most people in the group didn't finish it and give up on it, and because yeah, I just found it quite a slog, and it was so disappointing, because I've really loved Helen Oyeyemi's work before that I've read. I've read some short stories by her before, and I've wanted to explore more of her work, but I found the way she approached this story, so it's about a mother and a daughter, and the mother comes from a distant sort of land, but they live in a place which has a very like realistic feel. I think it's like modern day Britain, but the mother comes from a distant land where nobody knows the location of it. The way she approaches the story is just so, and she'll just sort of jump around between all these different subjects and themes in a way that felt really chaotic and really difficult to just understand what was going on. And sometimes I don't mind that so much, but in this case, I just didn't have the patience for to go through with it. I mean, the person in our group who did finish it said she thought it was worthwhile to actually finish it, but she acknowledged too that it was a real slog to get there. And so in a way, I'm kind of glad I did give up on it, because I think it was better to move on to something else, because I just really wasn't getting anything out of it. And I thought I would have liked it a lot more, because there's a lot of self-conscious talk about making gingerbread and gingerbread recipes. There's this sort of magical gingerbread recipe that is carried through their family. And normally, just because I like baking myself, I thought that would carry me through, but it really didn't, and I just didn't enjoy it, though it has a really beautiful, lovely cover. And I definitely want to read more by this author before, and some of her novels that she published before that I haven't read, but yeah, this novel I just really couldn't get on with. But it was really wonderful discussing it in a physical group rather than just discussing it online, I mean, which is wonderful in itself, but there's a very different feel when everybody's in the same room discussing a book. But what the book I went to read on after Gingerbread, when I put that aside, was Paul Takes the Form of a Mortal Girl by Andrea Lawlor. And I was so happy I made the switch to this book, because I loved this novel. I mean, I've been really anticipating it, and I was glad that it still surprised and delighted me, but gave me also what I was hoping it would give me. So it's about the central character. Paul is in 1993 in America and is a student, but not a very diligent one. He's more interested in writing his zine and having lots and lots of sexual encounters. And Paul's unique in that he's able to change genders and change his physical form to appear as somebody else. And so it has this sort of magical Orlando type feel to it. And I like how the novel converses with a lot of literature that has dealt explicitly with gender before, including Orlando, but also with a lot of different queer literature. And it plays upon that to form something completely new. And I just enjoyed it so much. I thought the tone of the book was sort of perfect. I mean, it sort of takes these issues of gender and queer identity really seriously, but at the same time, it's very playful and fun, and is just sort of having a good time with all the subjects, as well as depicting a lot of different scenes of sex. And so it shows intimacy from a lot of different angles, and showing the odd interplay between our expectations of what we want people to be and how we try to reform ourselves to suit other people's desires. It explores that so meaningfully, and I found it really moving, as well as very funny and playful, like I said, but also because Paul is a character that isn't entirely sympathetic, and he has a lot of flaws. He's very selfish and shallow in a lot of ways, but somebody that I nevertheless felt very endeared towards over the course of the novel. And it's partly because of my personal connection with this. I mean, the year 1993 was when I was an adolescent, and I was sort of forming my own identity and trying to figure things out. And so I got a bit nostalgic over the course of reading it, even though obviously Paul's experience is very different from my own. But just the way there's a lot of references to making mixtapes for people, and a lot of sort of events and things from the time of this sort of bygone era, but also describing that sort of coming of age experience and realizing who you are and trying to figure out what you want in life. So I just loved it so much, and really highly recommend it. Also, it was wonderful. This edition I got came with a zine that Paul had made, this sort of play upon the zine that he made. So it's a really funny funny addition to it, going through it, because it's, this thing that he forms that he feels really attached to, and he sort of thinks of as his best accomplishment, but which I think there's only been one issue of, and so he keeps thinking he wants to make another edition, but he's really trying to just make a living. And because another thing I really appreciated about this book was the real world way it portrays money and the struggles with money, and a young person just trying to survive in the world, and is constantly trying to figure out how much money is left in his account, and how he's going to pay the rent, and all those sort of real world issues, as well as dealing with this larger fantastical issue he has, where he can change genders and change his appearance in this way. And also I have to say that the inside cover of this is so cool. It's this black and white image that shows a sort of merging of all these different bodies, and which just is so great, because it shows really the theme of the novel. But the inside pages are just so cool. I also read a short Norwegian novel called Love by Hanne Orstavik, which I just absolutely loved. And I think this first came out in an English edition a year or two ago, but it's only just been published in the UK, and by the independent publisher And Other Stories. And the story is so simple, and the writing is very pared down, but is just so effective. So it portrays the story of a mother and her son, her adolescent son, who I think is just turning 13 or 14, and it's the son's birthday the next day, and he's expecting his mother to make him a cake, but the mother is just having this wild seeking adventure of her own, where she leaves her son at home alone and goes out to meet a man in a bar, and goes to a carnival where she meets a man there. And so it's a dual narrative following both of their perspectives on this journey over the course of a night, where they take different paths and meet some different people. But it's the stunning portrayal of loneliness, the way we like sort of go out in the world and try to find other people that we connect with, and even though we frequently fail, still have this searching desire. And it does this so effectively, while also having this air of menace about it the entire time. It feels really tense, because there are several points where you feel like something's going to go really, really wrong, and I like how it keeps the suspense of that, and the end of the novel is just completely devastating, but really powerful. So it's brilliant and effective. Like I said, having this very quite like simple style to it, but which is just so effective. And similarly, another novel that's sort of about suspense is Joyce Carol-Oates' new novel called The Pursuit, which is self-consciously labeled a novel of suspense. And she publishes these suspense novels every once in a while, or collections of suspense short stories. And in America, she publishes these sort of more genre type books with the Mysterious Press, and in the UK they're published with a publisher called Head of Zeus. There's this cover which is quite like spooky and effective, but I think the UK cover is really beautiful and is more in line, where it's a reproduction of a painting, and this is more in line with her mainstream fiction. So I think it's interesting that Head of Zeus published it in this way, and also just published it with the title Pursuit, rather than The Pursuit, like in the US. So this is the story of a woman who is just a new bride, and she just got married the day before, but is very haunted by these very disturbing dreams that she has, where she's walking through a field filled with bones and skulls, and incredibly haunted by this. At the very beginning of the novel, she is thinking of these things, and then she steps out of a bus and steps in front of a bus and gets knocked down and has a concussion and goes to the hospital. And so it follows her husband trying to help her recuperate, but also then goes into the backstory of her parents and the very complicated issue of her family's past. And she does this in a very realistic way, with a lot of vivid detail to it. I mean, it's sort of what Oates specializes in that she's able to recreate the psychological reality of her characters, who quite often are sort of going off the rails or going insane, and you can almost follow their path of logic or bad logic that they have, because they feel increasingly justified in their own perspective, even though we can see from the outside that this is a very flawed way of thinking. And I think it's really powerful how Oates is able to do this, but also she has something, I think, in her books recently where she will present these almost like dual realities, so you don't know which one is actually happening. It seems like there's one path that the characters take, which is probably the actual reality, and then there's another path which is sort of the psychological reality where they feel themselves trapped in. And I thought it was really interesting how the central character of this, she's so damaged and haunted by the trauma of her past that she becomes almost trapped in this fairy tale of her own making. And I think it's so unique how Oates has done that. So then I read or started reading another short novella that I was really looking forward to, called Exquisite Cadavers by Meena Kandasamy, because I'd loved her novel When I Hit You, and this was only first published a couple of weeks ago, and I've seen some really big positive reactions to it, but for me personally, I just couldn't get into it, and it's a really interesting issue, the way the author handles this. So she's almost haunted by the reception of her past novel, When I Hit You, because when that book came out, a lot of reviewers and interviews that she had were focusing on the autobiographical elements of it, even though she labeled it a novel. And I think she was really upset by how that reception, and it's something she self-consciously talks about in this book. At the very beginning of the book, she talks about the reception of that, and I can understand how she was frustrated by it, and how she wrote this novella almost as a response to that. So it's a book in two parts, and it's actually the text is split across the page. So you see there's one part which is a sort of novel and a story that she's writing. And then the other side is the autobiographical elements, I think, where she's showing the research she did and what the real life inspiration that went into writing the novel part, which is a really interesting idea. But in practice of reading it, I just felt a bit discombobulated about how to actually read this. Like, do I just read one half of it first and then go back and read the other half, or do I just read one side of the page and then read the other side of the page? And I was trying to do it in sections, where I would read one section on one side and then go back and read the other half of that section, but that I just couldn't really get into either story doing it that way, and I found that really frustrating. And so I just put it aside and didn't finish it, which I feel a bit disappointed about, because, like I said, I was really looking forward to this, but yeah, it just really didn't work for me. And maybe if I was in a different mood, I could go back and get more out of it. But yeah, at the moment, I just couldn't do it. But I think it's interesting how this seems to be an issue with a number of authors, because I felt like Nicola Barker had the same issue a few months ago when she published a short novel called I Am Sovereign. And in that novel, she self-consciously talks about her previous novel, Happy, and the reception of that. And yeah, it seems to be a weird issue where authors are almost like haunted by their past experiences of publishing these things, and are sort of self-consciously reacting to the reception of those books. But I feel like when you go to a new novel, you just want to be immersed in this new story and this new fictional experience, and I would rather mostly just sort of move on from that and leave that behind, rather than working with these issues so self-consciously. I also read a book of short stories called Lake Like a Mirror by Ho Sok Fong, and these are short stories which mainly center around the lives of different Malaysian women from different backgrounds and different contexts. Some of the stories are slightly more surreal in their tone, and some are a bit more realistic. And I like that sort of play of different styles, but they're all really beautifully written. And one of the most powerful stories I thought was the title story, Lake Like a Mirror, which is about a teacher who finds herself in an educational system which is increasingly restrictive about what is allowed to be taught. And I think she gets the tension of that so well, and recognizing how there's a student who is obviously gay and trying to come out and needs support, but she's not able to support him in the way that she really wants to. And so it's sort of about the distance between people. And I think she gets that in a really moving way, using different metaphors. And then there's another story about a woman who wants to be attached to a family and is at this sort of fun fair and continues making them have fun in this almost manic way, where it's sort of insisting, even though they're all exhausted and want to go home, she's like, no, we need to go on more rides. And I thought that was so funny, as well as being very moving. So yeah, I thought this was a really good collection. I'd really like to read a novel by this author. I don't know if she's written much else or if this is a debut collection or not. I read Underland by Robert Macfarlane finally. I've been wanting to read this book all year, ever since I saw him speak earlier this year. And I just loved it. So this is a nonfiction book about the author's experiences traveling into different subterranean areas of the world. He sort of travels all over the world, and he has a guide in a number of different places, like in the Arctic and the ancient caves in Norway and Spain, and goes to the subterranean levels of different cities like Paris and London, and meets these quirky different characters along the way of people who either work in these areas, either like in a mining company, or who are doing scientific research in these parts, or who are people who it's just sort of a lifestyle that they like to explore these subterranean spaces, either of these different cave networks or spaces which were man-made and have been kind of abandoned, and are sort of, they're not officially supposed to go down in them, but it's almost like a culture that will explore these different spaces. And he looks at this issue of deep time, which is a way of sort of looking at both space and time as a way different from our normal everyday reality, where you go down to the subterranean layer and you see these geological formations which are thousands and thousands of years old, and you suddenly have this literal touchstone to the very distant past, and you can see artifacts and things that have been left by past civilizations, but also the different layers of changes to the weather over the epochs of the world. And so it's a different way of seeing the world. I felt how it really shifted my perspective thinking about, because we're so locked in our everyday reality and time, and thinking like, okay, it's November now and this year, and we have these spaces which just are our home and our workplace, and we sort of go back and forth between those, and we get so locked in these individual spaces that we sort of forget that we're connected and traversing these areas of the world which have this distant past as well. And so the author finds, going down into these subterranean spaces, that he has this touchstone to this different kind of reality from what we normally think about. And obviously there's a lot of environmental concerns that are explored in this issue, because he goes to visit different glaciers which are rapidly disappearing, and talking about nuclear waste, which is hidden away and buried in these different areas, and how, probably ironically, a lot of this nuclear waste will outlast probably most of the rest of civilization and what we leave behind, because this is highly toxic waste, which will persist over many thousands and thousands of years. So I found that all the critics are right. This is an incredibly moving and powerful book, and it's the very first book I've read by Robert Macfarlane. I'm sort of followed him on social media for ages and found the way he talks about language and the way we articulate our relationship with the natural world very moving. And so I'm so glad that that's carried through into the book, and I want to explore more of his book. So I wasn't actively participating in nonfiction November, but I did end up reading that book, and I have also been reading the biography of Thomas Cromwell by Diarmaid MacCulloch, and this is part of this bigger, grander plan I have to read about the life of Thomas Cromwell before going back and trying to read Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall again, because that's a novel that I started and just couldn't really get into because I feel like I didn't understand enough about the context of the history of that period of time and the political struggles that were going on. I mean, I know broadly overview what happened with Henry VIII and the change of breaking from the Pope and the Catholic Church, but I don't understand a lot of the particulars of it. So I thought reading this biography would help me get into that novel realm, because the third part of Hilary Mantel's trilogy is coming. And so, I thought it was so clever having this grand plan, and was going to read this nonfiction book, which is like 750 pages or so, I think. So it's a really long biography. And the author of it talks self-consciously about complimenting Hilary Mantel's fictional work. And in Hilary Mantel's novels, she compliments this biographer for his work. So obviously they're very conversant in this period of time and thinking about Cromwell's life. But I found, unfortunately, I'm still reading this book, and I am persisting with it and finishing it. And I'm listening to it on audiobook, and I'm glad I am, because I don't think I could read it in its physical form because it would just be too overwhelming. And I found the first half of it a real slog, this really difficult, hard-going work. And I think that's partly because my own interests just aren't so much in this period of time, and with these types of people, these types of politicians and royalty. I mean, I just don't have a personal interest in that, or a natural affinity, or to want to read about them. So sort of like from an academic point of view, I can appreciate it and know that they're important, and it was a very important period of history and English history, but I just found it difficult to engage with. And the way he writes about it, I think he based a lot of his research in letters and reconstructing letters and sort of people's positions at that time. And the way he goes through and lists a lot of different people and their either political positions or positions in the aristocracy, I just found really disengaging. Like it just almost came across as a list of people that was sort of disconnected from everything. And I can appreciate the sort of thoroughness of his research and wanting to include all of this, but at the same time, I just didn't find it very meaningful, all of those sections and people which didn't all play a crucial role in this. And he almost weirdly skips over a big period of Thomas Cromwell's life. So he skips over a lot of his childhood and his marriage, which he had a wife who died at a fairly young age and had children, and he sort of almost skips over to that part to get to his political ambitions and his rising in power to become a strong, confident, and important player in Henry VIII's court. And so for me personally, he almost skips over a lot of the interesting personal stuff about Cromwell's life to get into the political power plays that were going on, which I personally just find really boring. It's just a lot of people striving for to gain dominance and to gain titles and power and influence in the society, which is, I know it's important, but I just find that sort of egotistical drive really difficult to engage with or sympathize with. So I can see how this is probably a good biography, but for me personally, what I like to read about people's lives and in my own interests in general, it's just really not for me. And I can tell that the biographer he's really into this subject and all of these people, and has, this very geeky, meticulous interest in all of it. But I personally don't share that interest, so find it very difficult to relate with. So yeah, I mean, I guess I'm sort of glad I'm doing this, but it makes me also a bit nervous now. Like, will I find the same thing when I go back to reading Mantel's fiction? In a way, it makes me really eager to go to that, because I'm craving more emotional evocation of these people's lives, which I think Mantel will probably do in her fiction, but just the technical details of it I don't find as interesting. But it makes me nervous that I might find the novels boring as well. But I'm hoping, I'm still optimistic and hoping that I'll really enjoy them. I've just not been enjoying it so much. I've just found it a real slog, and I'll be glad when it's over. Although it's sort of picked up in the second half of the book, and I've been enjoying it more when it gets more into the heated debate and the real bloody debate of lots of people are being executed left and right as these different power plays are going on. So there's a lot of like really gritty, awful detail to it, but which is more holding my interest than the first half of the book. So I am looking forward to finishing it, but it's taking me a while to get there. So that's what I've been reading. Let me know if you've read any of these books, any of your thoughts or feelings about them, or just let me know what you've been reading over the month of November as well, and how you've been doing. But thank you for watching, and I hope you're doing well, and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye everyone.